November 9, 1971, Westfield, New Jersey. A quiet Tuesday morning in one of America's wealthiest suburbs. Frost on the lawns, children bundling up for school, station wagons backing out of driveways. At 431 Hillside Avenue, inside a massive Victorian mansion called Breeze Knoll, a father named John List is making breakfast for his 3 children. He packs their lunches. He reminds them to study for their tests. He kisses them goodbye as they walk out the door. By the time the sun sets that evening, all 5 members of the List family will be dead. The killer will arrange their bodies in neat rows beneath a Tiffany stained glass skylight worth over $100,000. He will clean the crime scene methodically. He will cut his own face out of every family photograph. He will turn on a religious radio station, lock the front door, and drive away. And he will disappear for 18 years. This is the true story of John Emil List, the accountant, the Sunday school teacher, the devoted father, who murdered his entire family to save their souls and then lived a quiet, ordinary life under a stolen name while the FBI searched the world for him. This is the story of Breeze Knoll. John Emil List was born on September 17, 1925, in Bay City, Michigan, a small industrial city on the shores of Lake Huron. He was the only child of John Frederick List and Alma Barbara Florence List, both German immigrants who had come to America seeking stability and respectability. John's father was a factory worker, rigid, cold, and authoritarian. He ruled the household with an iron fist. Affection was rare. Mistakes were punished. Obedience was the only acceptable behavior. John's mother, Alma, was intensely religious. She attended the local Lutheran church multiple times a week. She raised John to believe that the world outside their home was sinful, corrupt, and dangerous. She controlled his friendships, monitored his reading, and taught him that only strict adherence to God's law could save him from damnation. John grew up isolated, awkward, and obsessed with rules. He had few friends. He spent his childhood indoors, studying, reading, and memorizing Bible verses. His mother told him repeatedly that he was special, that he was destined for greatness, that lesser people would never understand him. By the time he reached adulthood, John List believed 3 things with absolute certainty: that he was smarter than most people, that appearances mattered more than truth, and that God was always watching. In 1943, at age 18, John enrolled at the University of Michigan to study business administration. He was a diligent student, organized, punctual, and detail-oriented, but he struggled socially. He had no close friends. He joined no clubs. He attended no parties. He simply studied, attended church, and waited for the world to recognize his superiority. In 1943, World War II was raging. John enlisted in the U.S. Army and served as a laboratory technician. He never saw combat. He spent the war in administrative roles, working with numbers and records. When the war ended in 1945, he returned to the University of Michigan and completed his degree. In 1950, he earned a master's degree in accounting. He was 25 years old, highly educated, and ready to build the life his mother had always promised him, a life of success, respect, and financial security. But reality had other plans. In 1951, John List met Helen Morris Taylor. She was a widow, older than him by nearly a decade, with a young daughter from her previous marriage. Helen was everything John was not: outgoing, worldly, comfortable in social situations. She drank occasionally. She smoked. She had lived a life far removed from the strict, joyless existence John had known. For reasons that remain unclear, John married her. Perhaps he was lonely. Perhaps he believed marriage was the next expected step in building a respectable life. Perhaps he simply wanted to prove to his mother, and to himself, that he was capable of being a husband. The marriage was troubled from the beginning. Helen quickly realized that John was not the man she thought she had married. He was controlling, emotionally distant, and obsessed with appearances. He demanded that she stop drinking, stop smoking, and attend church every Sunday. He criticized her parenting of her daughter. He refused to discuss finances, emotions, or anything that might challenge his authority as head of the household. Helen, for her part, struggled to adapt. She resumed drinking in secret. She grew depressed and resentful. The marriage became a cold, silent battle. 2 people living in the same house, barely speaking, holding on to the illusion of normalcy for the sake of appearances. Between 1955 and 1958, they had 3 children: Patricia, born in 1955, John Frederick, born in 1956, and Frederick, born in 1958. John saw the children as his responsibility to mold, discipline, and control. He enforced strict rules: no television on school nights, no friends visiting the house. Church attendance was mandatory. Disobedience was met with cold silence or lectures about sin and damnation. Helen, meanwhile, retreated further into alcohol. The children grew up in a house where love was conditional, where silence was normal, and where their father's rigid control defined every aspect of daily life. And all the while, John List moved the family from city to city, chasing jobs he could never quite hold on to. Despite his degrees and credentials, John List could not maintain steady employment. He worked for banks, accounting firms, insurance companies, and manufacturers. On paper, he was qualified. In practice, he was a disaster. Colleagues described him as arrogant, condescending, and socially inept. He alienated supervisors with his rigid adherence to protocol and his refusal to compromise. He clashed with co-workers over trivial matters. He was fired repeatedly. Between 1951 and 1965, the List family moved constantly: Detroit, Michigan; Kalamazoo, Michigan; Rochester, New York. Each move was the result of John losing another job, though he never admitted it to his family. He always framed the moves as promotions, as opportunities, as steps toward the success he believed he deserved. By 1965, John had secured what seemed like a stable position: vice president and comptroller of a bank in Jersey City, New Jersey. The job came with a respectable salary, a title that sounded impressive, and the promise of financial security. It was then that John List decided to buy Breeze Knoll. In 1965, the List family moved to Westfield, New Jersey, a wealthy suburban town about 20 miles west of New York City. Westfield was home to lawyers, doctors, executives, families with old money and Ivy League pedigrees. John List wanted to belong. He found a house at 431 Hillside Avenue, a massive Victorian mansion built in the late 1800s. The house was called Breeze Knoll. It had been built by a wealthy industrialist and had passed through several owners over the decades. By the time List found it, the house was aging, drafty, and expensive to maintain, but it was still grand. Breeze Knoll had 19 rooms spread across 3 floors. It had a ballroom on the first floor with a ceiling skylight made of Tiffany stained glass, an original piece worth over $100,000 in 1965, equivalent to roughly $750,000 today. The house had ornate woodwork, high ceilings, sprawling grounds, and a detached garage. It was a house far, far beyond the List family's means. The purchase price was $50,000, manageable on paper with John's salary. But the upkeep, the heating bills, the repairs, the taxes, and the cost of maintaining appearances in a town like Westfield quickly became crushing. Within 2 years, List was drowning in debt. His mother, Alma, who had been living with them, contributed $85,000 from her savings to help with the house and expenses. But even that was not enough. And then, in 1969, John List lost his job at the bank. He told no one. Every morning, he woke up, put on a suit, picked up his briefcase, and pretended to go to work. Instead, he spent his days sitting in his car, reading newspapers at the train station, or wandering aimlessly through nearby towns. He came home at the expected time, ate dinner in silence, and retreated to his office. For 2 years, John List lived a lie. Helen's drinking worsened. The children grew older and began questioning their father's strict rules. Patricia developed an interest in theater and acting, activities John saw as sinful. John Frederick began expressing doubts about religion. Frederick, the youngest, struggled in school. To John List, his family was slipping away from God. The house was falling apart, the bills were piling up, and the lie, the great suffocating lie, was about to collapse. In John's mind, there was only one solution. He would kill them all, not out of rage, not out of hatred, out of love. Because if he killed them now, while they were still young, while their souls were still salvageable, they would go to heaven. If he let them live, they would fall into sin, corruption, and damnation. And so, in the autumn of 1971, John List began to plan. On the morning of November 9, 1971, John List woke early. He made breakfast. He prepared lunches for his children. He reminded them to take their coats. It was cold outside. He watched as Patricia, John Frederick, and Frederick walked out the front door heading to school. Helen was still upstairs. His mother, Alma, was on the third floor in her apartment. John went to the closet where the family kept a collection of firearms. He selected 2 weapons, a 9mm Steyr, 1912 semi-automatic pistol that had belonged to his father, and a .22 caliber Colt revolver. He loaded both guns. Around 9 a.m., John walked into the kitchen. Helen was sitting at the table, drinking coffee, likely nursing a hangover from the night before. She may have heard him approach. She may have turned her head. John raised the pistol and fired once. The bullet struck Helen in the back of the head. She collapsed instantly, her body slumping forward onto the table, then sliding to the floor. Blood pooled beneath her. John stood over her for a moment. Then he grabbed her by the arms and dragged her body through the house, down the hallway, and into the ballroom. He laid her carefully on the floor, beneath the Tiffany stained glass skylight. He straightened her clothing. He arranged her arms at her sides. Then he climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor. His mother, Alma, was 84 years old. She was frail, hard of hearing, and spent most of her days in her small apartment. She may not have heard the gunshot downstairs. She may have been reading, praying, or simply sitting in her chair. John entered the room. He raised the pistol. He fired once, striking her above the left eye. Alma List died instantly. John left her body where it fell. He returned downstairs. He washed his hands. He made himself a sandwich. He ate lunch alone in the kitchen, a few feet from where he had killed his wife less than an hour earlier. Then he sat down and waited for his children to come home. At approximately 1 p.m., Patricia List, 16 years old, returned home from Westfield High School. She was interested in drama, in theater, in a world beyond the suffocating rules of her father's house. She was beginning to push back against John's control, and he saw it as rebellion against God. Patricia walked through the front door. She may have called out for her mother. She may have walked toward the kitchen. John was waiting. He raised the gun and fired. The bullet struck Patricia in the back. She fell near the entrance to the ballroom. John dragged her body beside her mother's. Around 2 p.m., Frederick List, 13 years old, came home. He was the youngest, quieter than his siblings, still obedient to his father's commands. He entered the house. John shot him in the back. Frederick's body joined his mother and sister in the ballroom. After killing Frederick, John List did something remarkable. He got into his car and drove to the bank. He calmly closed out his own checking account and his mother's savings account, withdrawing approximately $2,000 in cash. Bank employees later remembered him as polite and unremarkable. Then he drove to Westfield High School. He parked in the lot. He walked to the athletic fields and sat in the bleachers, watching his oldest son, John Frederick List, play in a soccer game. He sat among other parents. He clapped when his son scored. He made small talk with a neighbor. And then, when the game ended, he walked down to the field, met his son, and drove him home. John Frederick List was 15 years old. He was the oldest of the 3 children. He was beginning to question his father's religious extremism. He had started expressing doubts about church, about the Bible, about the rigid, joyless life his father demanded. To John List, this was the ultimate betrayal. John Frederick got into the car with his father. They drove home together. They walked into the house at 431 Hillside Avenue. What happened next is partially reconstructed from forensic evidence. At some point, perhaps in the entryway, perhaps in the hallway, John List raised the gun and fired at his son. But this time, something went wrong. John Frederick did not die instantly. He fought back. He ran. He struggled. Forensic investigators later determined that John Frederick was shot 10 times, multiple wounds to the chest, the back, the arms. The pattern of blood suggested he tried to flee, that he was pursued, that he fought for his life. Eventually, he collapsed. John List dragged his son's body into the ballroom and laid it beside the others. By 6 p.m. on November 9, 1971, all 5 members of the List family were dead. Helen, the wife who had drowned her unhappiness in alcohol. Alma, the mother who had raised a killer. Patricia, the daughter who wanted to act. Frederick, the youngest son who never had a chance. John Frederick, the boy who fought and lost. All of them lying in neat rows on the ballroom floor, beneath a priceless stained glass ceiling. And John List, standing alone in the silent mansion, began the next phase of his plan. After the murders, John List did not panic. He did not flee in terror. He did not break down in tears. Instead, he began a methodical process of staging, concealment, and deception. First, he placed his wife and 3 children into sleeping bags. He arranged them in neat rows on the ballroom floor, as if tucking them into bed. He left his mother's body on the 3rd floor. Then he went through the entire house, room by room. He gathered every family photograph, framed pictures on walls, albums on shelves, loose photos in drawers, and with a pair of scissors, he carefully cut his own face out of every single image. He removed himself from the family's visual history, as if erasing his existence. He gathered important documents, birth certificates, insurance policies, financial records. He turned on every light in the house. He turned the thermostat down to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, hoping to slow the decomposition of the bodies. He tuned a radio to WOR, a religious station broadcasting sermons and hymns, and left it playing at high volume. Then he sat down at his desk and wrote a 5-page letter to his pastor at Redeemer Lutheran Church. In the letter, John List confessed to murdering his family, but he did not express remorse. Instead, he explained, in calm, logical language, why he believed the killings were necessary. He wrote that Helen's alcoholism was leading her toward damnation, that Patricia's interest in acting was sinful, that John Frederick's doubts about faith would drag him into hell, that financial ruin would corrupt the entire family, turning them away from God. He wrote that by killing them now, while they were still young, while their souls were still redeemable, he was ensuring they would go to heaven. He asked his pastor to forgive him. He signed the letter, John List. Next, he wrote letters to his children's schools and to his mother's doctor, explaining that the family would be away for a few weeks, visiting a sick relative in North Carolina. He asked neighbors to collect the mail. Finally, on the morning of November 10th, John List packed a single suitcase. He locked the front door of Breeze Knoll. He got into his car, and he drove away. For nearly a month, no one entered Breeze Knoll. Neighbors noticed the lights were on constantly day and night. They heard the religious radio station playing endlessly. But Westfield was a quiet, private community. No one wanted to intrude. Teachers called about the children's absences. The school received the letter from John List about the family trip to North Carolina. They accepted the explanation. The neighbor who had agreed to collect the mail did so for a few days, then stopped. The mailbox overflowed. Weeks passed. Finally, on December 7, 1971, nearly a month after the murders, Westfield police received a call from Patricia List's drama coach, who had grown concerned about her prolonged absence. Police went to 431 Hillside Avenue and knocked on the door. No answer. They looked through the windows. The lights were on. The radio was still playing, but there was no movement inside. Police forced entry. The smell hit them immediately. In the ballroom, beneath the Tiffany skylight, they found 4 bodies in sleeping bags, decomposed beyond recognition. On the 3rd floor, they found a 5th body, an elderly woman, Helen List, Patricia List, Frederick List, John Frederick List, Alma List, all dead for a month, and John List was gone. The discovery of the bodies at Breeze Knoll made national headlines. Family of 5 found slain in New Jersey mansion. Accountant murders entire family vanishes. The FBI immediately opened a federal investigation. John List's name, photograph, and description were circulated to law enforcement agencies across the United States and internationally. The case was assigned to multiple FBI field offices, 23 in total. Investigators pieced together the timeline. They found the letter to the pastor. They reconstructed John List's financial collapse. They interviewed neighbors, co-workers, church members, but John List had vanished without a trace. There were no credit card transactions, no bank withdrawals, no sightings. He had planned his escape meticulously. He had withdrawn cash. He had likely stolen identity documents. He had no close friends, no family outside of those he had killed. There was no one to turn him in. The FBI pursued leads in dozens of states. Tips came in from across the country, sightings in Texas, California, Florida, Colorado. Investigators followed every lead, all of them dead ends. In 1972, Breeze Knoll burned to the ground in a fire ruled as arson. No one was ever charged. The Tiffany Skylight, the priceless work of art beneath which 5 people had died, was destroyed. By the mid-1970s, the case had grown cold. John List had become a ghost. What the FBI did not know, what no one knew, was that John List had driven west after leaving Westfield. He had traveled to Denver, Colorado, where he assumed a new identity, Robert Peter Clark. Using forged or stolen documents, Robert Clark created a new life. He found work as an accountant. He rented a small apartment. He attended a Lutheran church and joined the congregation. He was quiet, unremarkable, and utterly ordinary. In 1985, Robert Clark met a woman named Dolores Miller at church. She was a widow, kind and religious. They began dating. In November 1985, they married. Dolores had no idea who her husband really was. Robert Clark worked steady jobs, attended church every Sunday, and lived a simple, middle-class life. In 1988, he and Dolores moved to Midlothian, Virginia, where he took a job at an accounting firm. For 18 years, John List lived as Robert Clark, hidden in plain sight, attending church picnics, filing taxes, and living among people who had no idea they were standing next to one of America's most wanted fugitives. But the case was never closed, and in 1989, everything changed. In early 1989, producers at a new television program called America's Most Wanted began researching unsolved cases for an upcoming episode. The show, hosted by John Walsh, featured reenactments of crimes and asked viewers to call in tips if they recognized the suspects. The List family murders, still unsolved after 18 years, seemed like a perfect case. But there was a problem. No one knew what John List looked like in 1989. The only photographs were from 1971. List would now be 63 years old. He could look completely different. The producers commissioned Frank Bender, a forensic sculptor, to create an age-progressed bust of John List. Bender studied photographs of List from the 1970s. He analyzed bone structure, considered patterns of male aging, factored in genetic traits like baldness and jowl development, and created a life-sized clay sculpture. The result was a haunting, eerily accurate depiction of what John List might look like 18 years later. Balding, jowly, with deep-set eyes and a receding hairline, wearing large glasses. On May 21, 1989, America's Most Wanted aired the episode. It featured a reenactment of the murders, interviews with investigators, and a prominent display of the age-progressed sculpture. The episode was watched by millions of people across the United States. And in Richmond, Virginia, a woman named Wanda Flannery was watching. She turned to her husband and said, "That looks exactly like Bob Clark from church." She picked up the phone and called the FBI tip line. On June 1, 1989, 11 days after the America's Most Wanted episode aired, FBI agents and U.S. Marshals surrounded an accounting firm in Richmond, Virginia. Inside, a man named Robert P. Clark was sitting at his desk, working on tax returns. Agents entered the building and approached him. They identified themselves. They asked for his name. "Robert Clark," he said. They asked for identification. He provided a driver's license in the name of Robert P. Clark. They took his fingerprints. Within hours, the fingerprints were compared to military records from John Emil List's service in the U.S. Army during World War II. They matched. Robert P. Clark was John Emil List. Even after his arrest, List maintained the lie. He insisted he was Robert Clark. He refused to admit his identity. He signed extradition documents as Robert Clark. He told investigators they had the wrong man. But the evidence was overwhelming. Fingerprints, dental records, physical scars that matched John List's medical history. Finally, on February 16, 1990, more than 7 months after his arrest, John List confessed. He admitted that he was John Emil List. He admitted that he had murdered his family. And he explained, calmly and without remorse, why he had done it, to save their souls. John List was extradited to New Jersey to stand trial. The trial began in late 1990, nearly 20 years after the murders. The prosecution's case was straightforward. John List had methodically killed 5 members of his family. He had planned the murders in advance. He had shown no remorse. He had fled and lived under a false identity for 18 years. The defense argued that List had been legally insane at the time of the murders. That religious delusion had driven him to believe killing his family was an act of salvation. Psychiatrists testified. The 5-page letter to the pastor was read aloud in court. John List himself took the stand and explained, in calm, emotionless language, that he had killed his wife, his mother, and his 3 children to prevent them from falling into sin and damnation. He said he believed he had acted out of love. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days. On April 12, 1990, John Emil List was found guilty on all 5 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences, 1 for each victim. Under New Jersey law, he would not be eligible for parole for 125 years. John List showed no emotion as the sentence was read. John Emil List spent the rest of his life in Trenton State Prison in New Jersey. He attended chapel services. He worked in the prison library. He maintained his innocence, not in the legal sense but in the moral sense. He believed, until the day he died, that he had saved his family's souls. In interviews, he expressed no regret. He said he missed his family. He said he wished things had been different, but he never said he was wrong. On March 21, 2008, John Emil List died in prison. He was 82 years old. He had lived 37 years after murdering his family, far longer than any of his victims had been allowed to live. Helen List was 47 when she died. Alma List was 84. Patricia List was 16. Frederick List was 13. John Frederick List was 15. All of them buried in a New Jersey cemetery, far from the mansion where they died. Breeze Knoll, the house at 431 Hillside Avenue, is gone. It burned in 1972. A new house stands on the property today. The address remains, but the mansion, the ballroom, the Tiffany Skylight, the 19 rooms, is only a memory. And John Emil List, the man who believed he could kill his way to heaven, is remembered not as a savior, but as one of the most methodical, cold-blooded family annihilators in American history. This is the story of Breeze Knoll. This is the story of 5 people who never escaped their father's control. And this is the story of a man who destroyed his family to save their souls and damned only himself.